Hi there, I'm Kim McKee. I'm a senior lecturer based at the University of Stirling. I'm also a co-investigator in the UK Collaborative Centre for Housing Evidence. And thanks very much for the opportunity to talk about my research on the private rented sector. It's an area I've been working in for the last 7 or 8 years. And what I'm going to present today is a kind of two projects. A recent project looking at middle-aged private renters, and also some of our work looking at the impact and issues for young people in the private rented sector. And this is research that I've done in collaboration with CASH colleagues at the University of Glasgow, Adriana Sueta and Moira Monroe. Okay. So I think we'll probably all be familiar with the kind of broad headlines around the private rented sector, but suffice to say there are now more than 4.5 million households living in the private rented sector across the UK, and this has more than doubled over the previous decade. It's home to roughly 1 in 5 households in the UK and around 1 in 7 in Scotland. But I think what's interesting here is there's a real age dimension to this housing tenure shift. The under 35s represent the largest group of private renters, and much attention has been given to the plight of millennials, like a generation rent, who are much less likely to own their own home or rent from a social landlord than in previous generations. And instead they're now spending longer periods of their lives in the private rented sector. Yet, at the same time, the number of middle-aged and older renters is also increasing, yet much less is known about their experiences, and this is why myself and my CASH colleagues from Glasgow decided to focus in on the impacts on people in this middle-age group, 35 to 54. And so what I'm presenting today draws on 2 CASH projects, and the links to the full reports are on the final slide at the end. But broadly speaking, the 2 participant groups were young people under 35 and a middle-aged group of 35 to 54, and both were drawn from England and Scotland. We had very similar approaches to recruitment, same type of topic guides, and we also asked people to send us photos in addition to taking part in a telephone interview. As I say, if you're interested in reading more about the specifics of the projects, this is all in the project report at the end. So if you have a wee look at the literature on intergenerational housing inequalities, what you'll see is that it often tends to pit young people and old people against each other. You know, this idea of the kind of greedy baby boomers stealing their children's inheritance. Yet what we found was actually a lot of shared experience and commonality between the young and old. Many of our participants, young and old, talked to us about the challenges of renting privately in the current context: unaffordable rents, insecure and precarious housing, poor quality housing. You know, many struggled to make ends meet. They had to put up with quite appalling conditions. Some had no hot water, windows nails shut, appliances that didn't work, dealing with mice. And on top of that, they were often grappling with the realities of the labour market at the lower end, you know, insecure, low paid work, the impact of welfare reform in terms of housing benefit and universal credit. And so these issues are all kind of interconnected. And many of them talked to us about shared accommodation, forced move and homelessness, but it wasn't just young people for whom HMOs and sofa surfing was an experience. This was also recounted to us by those in the middle-aged group. And you may be familiar with the idea of the bank of mum and dad, which is hit headlines in terms of the role of parental support in terms of helping young people access home ownership. Interestingly, we found that for some older middle-aged households it still remained important. We had one participant who talked to us about how she was relying on her dad in his 80s to act as a guarantor for her private rented sector contract. We had others who relied on older family members to help them pay their monthly rent, or who were delighted to receive a deposit from an elderly parent to help them on the property ladder to access a home of their own. So the bank of mum and dad actually never really goes away. It still remains important into middle age as well. And indeed, housing tenure insecurity was a really strong theme that came through in our project in terms of the tensions that it has with homemaking in particular. And I think you get a flavour of that from the quotes here on this slide. You know, this notion that a privately rented home is someone else's house. You know, I'm just living in it and paying for the privilege. And it comes back to this point about how the insecurity of the tenancy makes it difficult for people to form an attachment to the property, to put down roots, to feel settled and to make a home, and that's very well documented in the literature around the private rented sector. But I think all of these themes are really exacerbated in the current context of COVID-19, especially for low income households. The headlines, we've all seen the headlines around people struggling to pay their rent, what this means for arrears down the line. And although evictions have been paused, there's obviously worries about what will happen when this period passes and they resume again. We see millions more people claiming universal credit than ever before because of the impact on the economy of COVID. So all these challenges and issues that were there beforehand had been reported in the literature and in the kind of qualitative and quantitative evidence. Have not gone away. They've actually become much, much more acute, and it's really important policymakers take note of the findings that we're reporting in these projects. So I think where there is an interesting difference between the younger and older age groups is that young people tended to have a little bit more optimism. They tended to think that in difficult situations their housing might get better in the future, but the middle age cohort had much less hope for the future. And I think part of this was because some of them saw that they'd aged themselves out of a mortgage, so it's going to be very difficult for them to exit the private rented sector. And this is because lenders can be reluctant to approve loans that extend beyond people's retirement age when incomes typically drop. And this is especially the case for low-income households who don't have the cushion of a private pension. So many young and old expressed frustration at paying someone else's mortgage, this idea that it was money down the drain. They felt really frustrated and annoyed at their inability to save to transform their situation, and the only way many of them can manage was to choose less desirable properties, often in poorer conditions, which had lower rents, or to share with others in HMO properties. And as Cash's wider research has noted, these types of financial pressures can have real negative impacts on people's mental health and well-being. And for some, they also reported a kind of real sense of embarrassment or failure that they were still renting in middle age, and that they didn't see this situation changing for them down the line. And I think there was also some distinct pressures on parents. Many of them worried about forced moves, about the impact of forced moves on their kids, but also the financial costs of managing that. They were concerned about disruption to their kids' schooling, about the impact on social networks. So, for example, kids' friendship groups or the clubs and activities that they went to locally, but also the wider kind of web of social support that families rely on for childcare, often from family or friends. Many parents talked about the importance of personalising their property and keeping pets, and how this was really important to making their kids feel settled and feel at home, to put down roots. And I think Linda's quote here brings this out quite nicely. She spent a lot of time trying to, personalise her property and especially her child's bedroom. But at the opposite end of the spectrum, we saw some landlords would just not allow children to live at the properties. Some parents told us they kind of pretended they didn't have kids in order to access the property. Others that they'd been served Section 21s when they disclosed to the landlord they were pregnant. And some divorced dads talked about the challenges of shared accommodation, which they found themselves in, and how they kind of struggled to reconcile this with keeping in a kind of relationship with their kids, because bringing them back to shared accommodation wasn't always appropriate. So there's some challenges there in terms of family relationships and family dynamics. And I think there's also some interesting themes emerging around ageing bodies. Older age can bring poorer health, but the PRS as a sector isn't necessarily very well geared up to cope with these additional needs. There can be challenges around adapting properties. Landlords might be concerned about damage being done to properties, putting adaptations in, or the cost of putting things back to normal when that person moves out. And tenants may be wondering about whether they should, pursue these adaptations given the kind of insecurity of tenure and them not being sure how long they'll live in the property themselves. So there's kind of tensions here. And we had one participant who talked about it quite eloquently about the challenges of sharing properties when mobility aids are needed. And again, this is something the sector needs to be thinking about, given that renting in older age is going to become increasingly common as we go forward. So there's perhaps an opportunity here for more socially minded private rented landlords to get involved, providing accommodation to those households that maybe need a bit more support and more adaptations in the property to help them meet their needs. So finally, just to wrap things up, I just wanted to reflect very briefly in the 10 minutes I have on the key policy implications. I think what we saw was that tenants of all ages really want safe, secure, affordable homes. That's been the case in all the private rented sector projects I've been involved in, and I think it'd be fair to say that home has never been more important. It's where we're spending so much of our lives at the moment in the current context of COVID-19. For many it's not just, a shelter where we put our heads down at night. It's becoming our workplace, it's becoming where we school our kids, where we have our leisure time, you know, and the home is really the centre of everything at the moment. So having one and having a quality home that we can afford has never been more important, I don't think. I know there's been some positive tendency reform, particularly in Scotland, with other parts of the UK looking to Scotland and adapting things for their own purposes in different parts of the UK. There are still concerns quite rightly about insecure housing and unaffordable housing, even in the Scottish context. So I think it's important to avoid complacency here. A lot of the challenges around affordability pressures are also tied in quite closely with welfare reform, particularly around housing benefit and LHE levels, and there's really urgent action really needed to tackle the issue of unaffordable rents in the private rented sector, especially given the real damage to the economy that's been done by COVID and the impact that's going to have on many households in terms of their ability to pay their rent. And there's also questions that need to be thought about in terms of, how can the sector respond to an ageing population, how can we encourage good practice, how can we support landlords to engage in adaptations, how can we make tenants aware of that they can ask for them, and how to take that conversation forward with their landlords. I think there's much more to be done there. And finally, I'd just like to kind of finish by emphasising, as I like to do always, that it's really important when we're thinking about the private rented sector that we don't see it in isolation. We shouldn't look at the PRS in isolation of the other main tenures. They're all interlinked. But also housing is very much interwoven with labour markets. It's really impacted by things like welfare reform and the broader kind of patterns of income inequality in the country. So I think housing is very much interwoven with all these really big key issues, and these are all things that are really changing at the moment and really impacted hard by COVID. And I think there's a final question here for me around, although the professionalisation of the PRS has been really positive to see in some parts of the UK and is very much welcome, there's a bigger public policy question here of, can we really expect the private rented sector to be the safety net that low income and vulnerable households need? I think that's probably the question I'd like to kind of end with, and maybe where we need to reflect on going forward. What type of housing system are we aspiring to, really? So just to wrap up by signposting some further resources, these are all open access. You can read some more about our research that I've been talking about today. I'd also, at the end, have flagged up a new project I'm involved in with colleagues at Edge Hill and Cardiff. And just to say thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to your questions at the Evidence for Renting event. Bye for now.